Hey guys and gals, it's your buddy Drew with Living History's Mysteries and Ferocious Feline Productions. You know, certain stories from history stick out, especially the ones that contain the biggest mystery. While doing research on an upcoming video, a totally different subject, I was reminded of an incident that happened when I was only 3 years old. On the 24th of November, 1971, an average man carrying an average attaché case stepped onto an airplane and handed a note to one of the stewardesses. A note that would go down in history. A man that would go down in infamy. Of course, we're talking about D.B. Cooper. Still unsolved today, over 50 years later. You know, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it. I'm going to let you guys check out the facts. We'll talk afterwards. This is good.
The FBI is now looking for a strange man who hijacked a Boeing 737 and parachuted into the darkness with $200,000 and has never been spotted ever since. The sketches of the suspect were released this morning. If you know who this person is or have any information, contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation. On the 24th of November, 1971, a man strolled into the Portland International Airport in Oregon carrying a briefcase. The middle-aged man, dressed in a business suit, purchased in cash a $20 ticket for Northwest Orient Airlines, Flight 305, a flight that was headed to Seattle, Washington. He gave the name Dan Cooper and boarded the aircraft alongside 36 other passengers and a crew of 6. Upon boarding, Cooper settled in his aisle seat at the rear of the Boeing 727 and ordered a bourbon and soda, then topped it with a smoke while the flight was waiting to take off. Of course, it was the 70s, and in-flight smoking was permitted at the time. A few minutes after 3 p.m., Cooper signaled to a flight attendant, Florence Schaffner, and handed her an envelope. By this time, the plane was already in the air. In the envelope was a note indicating that he had a bomb in his suitcase, and for the safety of everyone, he wanted her to sit with him. To show that he meant business and wasn't bluffing, Cooper opened the cheap briefcase and showed the scared flight attendant a glimpse of a mass of wires, red-colored sticks that appeared to be dynamites, and a battery. The attendant did the math and was willing to cooperate. Cooper instructed that she write down blessings. The captain landed the aircraft on a partially lit runway, away from the main terminal. This was around 5:46 p.m., so it was getting dark. Tina left the aircraft through the front door, using a mobile staircase the ground crew had prepared, and retrieved the ransom. She walked through the seated passengers and delivered the bags of cash to Cooper, who was seated at the back of the cabin. As a show of good faith, Cooper allowed 2 flight attendants, as well as all 36 passengers, to exit the aircraft. Many of these passengers would later go home to discover they were hostages in one of the country's most daring plane hijacking, and didn't even know it. Now, Cooper had only 4 crew members aboard, whom he planned to take him to his next destination. He sent Tina to inform the pilot that they would be flying to Mexico City. He ordered that they fly with the landing gear down, the flaps at 15 degrees, and below 10,000 feet. He also demanded that the lights in the cabin be switched off, and the aft stairway, which opens from the underbelly of the fuselage, was to remain extended. It was dangerous to lower the aft staircase mid-air without being sucked out of the aircraft, so Cooper promised to retract the stairs if Tina remained by his side, and taught him how to extend them once the plane was airborne. At around 7:40 p.m., Flight 305 took off once again, with 2 fighter jets following the aircraft from a distance. Less than 5 minutes after takeoff, Cooper instructed Tina to head for the cockpit, and that he would love to be left undisturbed. This was the last time Tina saw Cooper. At around 11 p.m., the aircraft trim and return the aircraft to level flight. It is believed that the drop in cabin air pressure was a result of Cooper's jump. So, let's say that has answered the question when. It has raised more questions about where Cooper went after the jump. Knowing Cooper's destination seems to be impossible, since none of his actions pointed out that he had a specific destination in mind. For example, Cooper gave the pilots the flight configuration and where the plane should land, but he never gave them a flight route, meaning all he probably had in mind was to drop midair and find his way out wherever he found himself. While there were claims that he probably had people on the ground whom he hoped to link up with later, his actions spoke otherwise. If he had someone assisting him, he would have been more concerned about where to disembark. Instead, he chose to leave the aircraft into the dense cloud cover at 8 p.m., which would make it almost impossible for him to predict where he was going to land. In fact, Cooper became impatient when the refueling was taking so much time that he dismissed the pilot's request to file a flight plan and simply told him to get the show on the road. Using the details given by the pilot, Cooper's landing zone was predicted to be within an area on the southernmost outreach of Mount St. Helens, a few miles southeast of Ariel, Washington. The FBI immediately launched a massive search operation, which focused majorly on Clark and Cowlitz counties. The federal agency conducted door-to-door searches of local farmhouses, while birds were in the air looking for traces of the hijacker. They also had patrol boats along Lake Merwin and Yale Lake, the reservoir to the east of the predicted landing zone. The issue was that even if the estimated bailout point was accurate, there was no way they could accurately predict Cooper's drop zone due to the topography of the place. Aside from the difficult terrains, the low temperature and unfavorable weather conditions further complicated the search. Despite the large search party and days of hard work, neither Cooper nor any of the money or equipment he presumably carried was found. It was as though he vanished into thin air. Since all efforts to identify and locate Cooper proved abortive, the FBI in early December turned their attention to the ransom, hoping it could link them to the culprit. Even though the money was gathered in a rush, it could be traced. This was because the dollar bills handed to Cooper were collected from the Seattle First National Bank, and the money was stored in the bank for such purposes. Since the serial numbers had been documented beforehand, it was given to all financial institutions across the country, as well as government agencies and the general public. The goal was to make it difficult for Cooper to spend the money. In fact, at one point, the airline and several newspapers began to offer a reward for any member of the public who could deliver a note matching any of the serial numbers, until two men used fake $20 vans could not withstand exposure to open air or water for more than a year. But the bundles of cash were discovered 9 years later. How did the rubber band manage to stay intact that long? The most reasonable explanation is that someone, probably Cooper or someone else, buried the money. Did Cooper survive the fall to have buried the money, or did someone discover his remains and probably buried the rest of the cash? Well, these questions remain a mystery to date. From the onset, it is believed that Cooper never survived the fall. At the same time, anything that could have indicated that he died was never discovered. The assumption that Cooper jumped to his death can actually be justified. When Cooper jumped out of the aircraft, he jumped into a thunderstorm with winds over 100 miles per hour and temperatures well below zero at the 10,000-foot altitude, wearing a thin suit wrapped around sunglasses and a raincoat. There is little chance that he could survive with such an outfit. The thunderstorm was so strong that it ripped out an instruction placard from the aft stairway. The placard would later be discovered in 1978 by a deer hunter. Another reason the jump was considered fatal was the timing. Cooper chose to disembark from the plane late in the night. While this probably made him invincible to the two fighter jets, it took more from him. By such a late hour, the ground beneath would have been covered by multiple layers of clouds, meaning he jumped without knowing his precise location. Let's even assume he could see the ground and had a specific drop zone. The parachute he had on wasn't steerable. In other words, there was no way he could steer towards his intended landing zone. Even though Cooper displayed some experience with parachutes, his assumed parachute expertise could be questioned. While requesting multiple parachutes was a smart move, the FBI during the rush hour mistakenly added an unusable training chute. This dummy chute was designed for classroom demonstrations alone, so the students could understand how it feels to pull a ripcord. So, the dummy chute was designed to not deploy the canopy, even after pulling the ripcord. However, it appeared that Cooper left with the dummy chute. But that's not all. The primary chute Cooper went with was older, and was technically the inferior out of the two primary chutes provided. It is safe to say Cooper made the worst choice in both scenarios. However, if he used the dummy chute to pack the money, and not as a reserve, there might be chances of survival. Also, Cooper using an older parachute may not be attributed to inexperience. Think of it. It could be that he chose the chute he was familiar with, since the other was a civilian luxury parachute, while the one he went with was a military chute. This has raised suspicion that Cooper might have been a paratrooper, or at least had a military background. Another incident that supported this claim was when he mentioned that the McCord military base was only 20 minutes away from the Seattle-Tacoma airport. It's either he did his research well, or had a military background. The FBI also speculated that Cooper could be somehow associated with the CIA. Here's why. Cooper knew the uniqueness and some secrets of the Boeing 727. He knew that the aft air stairs could be operated during flight, and that if it is manually activated in the rear of the cabin, it cannot be overridden from the cockpit. All of these were not basic knowledge, or even known to civilian crews, but to military crews, because during the Vietnam War, the CIA used the 727 to drop agents and supplies into enemy's territories, leveraging on the aft air stairs. Whether Cooper knew this by research or learned from the CIA is also one of the many questions that remains unanswered. By the time the press learned about the hijacking, the FBI was already rounding up potential suspects, one of which was a man in Portland who bore the name Cooper and also had the initials DB. Your guess is as good as mine. No criminal in his right mind would give up his real name, and the FBI soon eliminated him as part of the suspects. However, in a subsequent news report, a reporter misheard his name as DB Cooper, and the rest, as they say, is history. name Dan Cooper was basically an alias. Cooper probably borrowed the name from a comic book series titled Dan Cooper. The French comic book was centered around a pilot named Dan Cooper and was not translated into English nor sold in the United States before 1971. On the other hand, the book was available in Canada the whole time, a country with a reasonable amount of French speakers. Officials recall that during the interview, most of the crew members stated that Cooper spoke with no certain accent. There are possibilities that he was a bilingual Canadian. He also used certain choices of words that pointed out that he was not an American. For example, while relaying his demands to air traffic control, he used the phrase, negotiable American currency. A proper American would have just said, American currency. However, we can't be so sure about these, because we don't know for sure if that was how Cooper said it directly, or if it has gone through paraphrasing by the captain. So, Cooper could have been a Canadian who saw the name in the comic book series, or was an American who got the name in another way. One thing is certain. Neither the authorities nor anyone can tell with certainty Cooper's real identity, and we may never find out. Over the past 53 years, the FBI has investigated over 1,000 suspects, but they still remain baffled, and many questions are left unanswered. Let's look at a few. Robert Rackstraw. Robert Rackstraw was a retired pilot and an ex-convict who served on an Army helicopter crew. Rackstraw could handle explosives, and once tried to fake his death by radioing a false mayday call. He was expelled from the Army just a few months before the hijacking, so we can say we see a motive here. But there's more. Rackstraw had an uncle named John Cooper, and while serving in the Army, he worked with units during the Vietnam War. Rackstraw ticked many of the boxes, and even had a physical resemblance to Cooper's composite sketch. But he was 27 years old in 1971, contrary to multiple claims that Cooper looked like a man in his mid-70s. He also had light-colored eyes, which Cooper did not. Joe Lockitch, a retired U.S. Army major and Korean War veteran, was also considered to be Dan Cooper, and they had good reasons. 2 months before the hijacking, Lockitch's daughter, Susan Giffen, was killed as a consequence of a clumsy hostage situation that the FBI didn't handle well. The incident would later be used as a case study for what not to do during a hostage situation. The retired Army veteran sued the FBI in court and won the case, with the court ruling that the FBI could have handled the hostage negotiation better. Lockitch drew attention, largely because Cooper's tie contained microscopic particles of uncommon metals, like unalloyed titanium. It is believed that only a few people at the time could be in contact with such material, suggesting that Cooper had probably worked in a manufacturing environment working on electronics. When the hijacking occurred, Lockitch was a production supervisor at an electronics capacitor factory and would have likely been exposed to the materials on the tie. Cooper, in his conversation, also mentioned that he had no grudge with the airline, but confessed that he had a grudge. Some believe that the grudge Cooper had was Lockitch's anger towards the FBI for failing to rescue his daughter 2 months earlier. However, this was not much to work with, as other suspects fit the description more and had more motives. This brings us to another suspect, Richard McCoy. In 1972, McCoy hijacked a Boeing 727 and escaped using the aft stairway, just like Cooper did. McCoy had an impressive portfolio, which made him a worthy suspect. He was an Army veteran who served 2 tours in Vietnam and successfully replicated Cooper's escape. While these 2 hijackings have several similarities, like both using a fake name, handwritten notes, and 4 parachutes, some pointers suggested that they were not executed by the same persons. McCoy came prepared for the jump. He had a skydiving helmet and jumpsuit. He also forgot to retrieve one of the notes he had passed on to one of the flight attendants. He was just 29 years old at the time, and all All three flight attendants were confident that McCoy wasn't Cooper. This small selection of suspects must have proven to you how almost impossible it can be to identify a suspect when there's limited information about them. These three selections, on the one hand, do not look like D.B. Cooper. On the other hand, he could have been any one of these suspects, but the absence of enough information can make the culprit walk free on our streets. Did D.B. Cooper survive the jump? Was Cooper in his mid-40s? Did they get his descriptions wrong? Which of the sketches was closest to D.B. Cooper? These questions remain unanswered, and we may never get answers to them. This is because, in July 2016, FBI accepted they may never find D.B. Cooper and officially closed down the case, citing that the crime-fighting resources could be put to better use elsewhere. But as long as his remains have never been found, or hardcore evidence he didn't survive the jump, it's safe to say that the D.B. Cooper legend continues.
Welcome back. You know, it's like I said in the beginning. This is an average man, average appearance, carrying an average attaché case. An attaché case that was rumored to be carrying a bomb. Was it a real bomb? Was it fake? Where'd this man go? What happened to him? How was he able to pull off one of the most historic crimes in the history of our country? Who was D.B. Cooper? Was that even his real name? The professionals say no criminal in his right mind would use his real name. But I think the actions of D.B. Cooper proved that this was a criminal unlike any other. Like I said, still to this day, 50 years later, the crime still hasn't been solved. And though they've had their ideas on who Cooper might have been, nothing's ever been proven. Did he survive? Did he perish in the jump? It's just one more mystery that history has left behind. Hope you guys enjoyed this look back at the legend of D.B. Cooper, a man, a plane, and a plan. Until next time, y'all take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. God bless you. God love you. We do. And we'll see you in history.